All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. It was there all along, how to examine records for overlooked clues and details. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Senior Genealogist Rhonda R. McClure. Rhonda is a nationally recognized professional genealogist and lecturer. Before joining American Ancestors in 2006, she ran her own genealogical business for 18 years. She was a contributing editor for Heritage Quest magazine, Biography magazine, and was a contributor to the History Channel magazine and American History magazine. In addition to numerous articles, she is also the author of 12 books, including the award-winning Complete Idiot's Guide to Online Genealogy, Finding Your Famous and Infamous Ancestors, and Digitizing Your Family History. She is also the editor of the 6th edition of the Genealogist's Handbook for New England Research. She has many areas of expertise, which include immigration and naturalization, late 19th and early 20th century urban research, State Department federal records, New England, the Midwest, Southern, German, French, Italian, Scottish, Irish, French Canadian, and Atlantic Canadian research. So it wasn't long ago that family historians had to spend significant time searching through archives and microfilm looking for a single record. And you can bet that when they found it, they studied that record carefully and gathered every possible detail from it. Today, however, there are so many records easily available online that it can be tempting to quickly glance at a record, save it, and move on to the next one. In this lecture, Rhonda will make the case for slowing down and scrutinizing each precious record that you find. She'll provide strategies for finding often overlooked details in records that can provide clues about your ancestors' lives and the times that they lived in. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There is also an optional syllabus available for purchase if you're interested, and your purchase helps to support us in making these free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Rhonda.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. The act of actually viewing our records and really getting everything out of them is really an art. There is an art to analysis. So let's jump right in. Now, the steps for doing our general research, our family history, is we always work from step 1 through step 5. So step 1 is to identify what you know. Step 2, decide what you want to learn, aka what's your research goal, what is it you're trying to find out. Step 3, identify and locate your sources. Step 4 is research. And then step 5 is analyze. And so for the purposes of this afternoon, we are focusing on step 5. But all of these steps kind of go hand in hand, and there is a lot of what we would call rinse and repeat. Because as you start with what you know and you look for missing information, the thing that happens is that you're always going to get clues to either additional questions or you're going to just simply get additional questions. So we're constantly going through this cycle from step 1 to step 5, though we may not always go through every step. If you kind of take anything away from, or nothing but this away from today's webinar, Take this. Work from the known to the unknown, especially with everything being, not everything, but a lot of things being online and we type in a name, we sort of jump haphazard from person to person, record to record. That actually is going to cause you frustration and could build your own brick walls. So you want to systematically work from the known to the unknown. And as I mentioned, we are focusing all about analyzing, and that was step 5 of our little rinse and repeat cycle. So you don't want to just read the record. You truly want to examine it. Extract all the details from the record. You want to examine each record alongside the other records you've collected for a particular person. Does the new record answer research questions, or does it bring up any other new questions or bring up possible conflicts between two records? And then you want to record your results. The really good basic volume on analysis is Robert Charles Anderson's Elements of Genealogical Analysis. And he breaks that down into 3 different types: source analysis, record analysis, and linkage analysis. Now, for the purposes of today, we're really going to just focus on source and record, but the 2 of those go together. Now, analyzing the source and the record, the first thing we really need to understand is what is the difference between a source and a record? We often use those 2 words interchangeably, and we probably shouldn't, because a source is a coherent collection of records created by a single jurisdiction or a single author for a defined purpose, whereas a record is that portion of a source which pertains to a single event, a single individual. So comparing sources and records, the source would be the census, whether it's 1850, 1920. The source is the census. The record is a specific household within that census. Likewise, if you're dealing with a will book, the wills, the probate records, those are your source, but the will of, in my example here, Sarah Reed, is your record because it's the very specific item that deals with, in this case, Sarah Reed. Similarly with church records, Christ Church Boston baptisms, that is our source. The record would be the baptism of Thomas Robinson. World War I draft cards, that is a large, nationwide source. And then the card of a very specific ancestor, in this case, I'm using my grandfather here, Thurlow Everett Eyre of Lowell, Massachusetts, that is our record. Similarly, Massachusetts Grand Lodge of Masons membership cards, 1733 to 1990 would be our source, and the record would be his card when he was a member. Another valuable resource in understanding analysis as it pertains to family historians is this wonderful little, it's a very small 5 by 8 book, very thin, Elizabeth Shun Mill's Evidence, Citation, and Analysis for the Family Historian. The first half is devoted to the art of analysis. Second half is a lot of very good citation examples. But one of the things you want to take out of that is take your time with each record. Now, when it comes to analyzing a source, consider whether you are looking at an original or a photo or a digital copy of an original or a copy of a document. Are you looking at an index or an excerpt? Information could be lost in indexing, or information could be incorrectly indexed. Likewise, abstractions and transcriptions, there can be typos, all sorts of things. Also, is this an authored document? And if so, does it have citations? Meanwhile, when it comes to the record analysis of just the record itself, Why was this record made? In other words, why do we have World War I draft cards? And who created the record? Who provided the information that's being recorded? AKA, who is our informant for the information on our ancestor? And then, are there any contradictions within the information given between this record and the others that we have amassed? So let's talk about record examination. For the purposes of today, I'm going to show various examples of the records you see here. So vital records, church records, census records, deed, AKA land records, draft records, and immigration records. Biggest thing, don't assume you know what the record will tell you. When we do that, we do not actually read the record. So let's begin by talking about vital records, a record that we use all the time. This is definitely what I would classify as our most used record. We want to look at it for very specific details. I'm not going to lie, many clues get overlooked throughout my experience when I have been giving consultations with people. I will ask questions of the person who has signed up for the consultation for information that would have been found on the specific record, and they often will say, I don't know. So let's start out with a birth record. Now, I've been doing genealogy. I joke, I say I've been doing it longer than I've been alive. This is an actual document that I have had forever that my grandfather gave me when I got into genealogy. And it was basically what we would call a certified copy of his birth. And at the time that he gave it to me, he felt he didn't need it any longer. The date of the copy itself is from 1957, although he was born in 1899. Now, as we look at the top of the record, there's a couple of things that I'm pointing out here. The first thing is that I have highlighted that because remember, this is a certified copy. So they looked in their book in the town hall, and then they filled out this form using their typewriter to supply all the info. So what they've done is they've told me that the original was recorded uh, on the 6th of February, 1900, and it was record number 252 for that particular time period. The one thing that I've underlined in red says, as amended September 28, 1927. Now, he got this certificate in 57, and so that would have made him roughly about not quite 58, because his birthday was in August. However, when he handed this over to me in 1985, he commented and he said, I don't understand what was amended in this record. So that, and I heard him say that. I filed away as a dutiful baby genealogist. I put this in my folder and I just left it there. Now, we've got his birth, his information, and then, of course, because it's a birth record, we have information about his parents, Henry H. Eyre and Elizabeth Dollar, giving occupation and places of birth. It is because I was struggling with dear old Elizabeth Dollar here that I even began to dig deeper into my grandfather and his siblings. Another tip, do not assume you know everything that you're going to find. So as I was going through the various records, I was out in Salt Lake City. I was pulling microfilms. This was back in the dark ages when we didn't have the internet. And I was going through, I knew that they had all been born in Woburn. So basically what I was doing was I was pulling the film and then I was getting to the registers for Woburn. These registers that you see here are what are known as the state's copy. The town clerk sent the state a register page of the copies of vital records happening in their community. And they began to do this in 1841. So I had the dates of birth of his siblings, and I was going through looking predominantly to see if Elizabeth Dollar ever said she was born someplace else besides Prince Edward Island. And so I'm going through, and ultimately I get to the 1899, and I almost skipped it because it's my grandfather. I had his birth certificate. I already know when he was born. I know everything there is to know about him, right? But instead, I thought it would be good to have another version of his birth information, something that was recorded perhaps earlier than that abstract of 57. And so I went through this. I'm looking down, and basically what I was doing is I would just go through the names on each page. I wasn't looking at the dates. I would go through the names on each page for each year until I found an heir, and then I would see if it was one of my grandfather's siblings. So I'm going along and I see the one that I have highlighted here in yellow, and it's an heir. The parents are Henry H. Eyre and Elizabeth Dollar. Everything there matched. Blacksmith, New Brunswick, PEI. What didn't match was I had no idea who this George T. Eyre was. Then I looked at the actual date of birth, which is the first column after the number column, and that was my grandfather's birth date. So instead of finding my grandfather with his name, Thurlow Everett Eyre, I instead found this birth entry for George T. Eyre. Obviously, I had a question. Who is George T. Eyre? Now I went back to the abstract I had and compared the information and the number, document number, and sure enough, that matched with the birth date, with everything having to do with the certificate I have for my grandfather. So I'm like, okay, apparently my grandfather did not start out with the name that he ended up with the rest of his life. He started out as George T. Eyre. Now, in Massachusetts, there are registers that are called additions and corrections. And because I knew he had that amended item, I started to look to see how far up those went for the available records. While Massachusetts is an open state, you sometimes have to physically be there to view certain types of records. However, I was able to find that there was a date of correction for 24 January 1918, which was literally about 4 months after my grandfather had turned 18. And in this particular item, he is listed as Thurlow Everett Eyre. The spelling of the name, though, is Thurlough of his first name. And for some magical reason, his parents are now born in Ireland. Of course, the other two people on this register were also supposedly their parents were born in Ireland. So right away, I've got something that conflicts with everything else I know about this family. So now I went and compared all three items that I had found. The biggest thing being the number of the actual certificate. So the number as it appeared everywhere was consistently number 252. The February 6, 1900 matched with the state copy that I had found that called him George. And then the number and the date of birth matched with the amended or corrected record register that I found that was dated in 1918, where he becomes Thurlow Everett instead of George T. So a grandfather by any other name? Apparently he was born George T. Eyre. Perhaps the T was Thurlow. I'm not sure. 24 January 1918, I know it was definitely amended to Thurlow Everett Eyre. My guess is that the subsequent amending of 28 September 1927, a record I have not been able to find though, but because of the way it was worded on the 1957 abstract, would seem to lead to the idea that it was amended to the spelling that he went with for the rest of his life, which was the THOU. Start to Thurlow. Now, all records that are vital records come with a lot of forms in them. And here we have a death record for a woman named Ella Peavy. And I was working with somebody in a consultation. She said that after Ella's husband had died, she returned to New York and she moved in with her daughter. And that's where she died. However, when we pulled up the death record, what we discovered was she actually hadn't been living with her daughter. Instead, she appeared to be living in Flanders Hotel because that is who was giving the information to the hospital for the death record. So it's very, very important to always look at the informant, especially on death records, because that is going to be somebody who's still alive. So it's not going to be coming from Ella, it's coming from somebody else. And as we can see here, because it was from the hotel, they didn't know a whole lot about her. I'm going to say they assumed she was born in the USA, as were her parents. And then all the other information would have been supplied by the hospital and the doctor as to why, how she died, etc. So always look at your informant because in large part, what you're going to find is that the informant may or may not know what they're talking about. And very often, especially if somebody is dying, say in a pauper home or in a specialty hospital, it's possible that the hospital is the informant, not a family member. Marriage records are one of my favorite records, in large part because the information is coming from the bride and the groom, who are, of course, alive when all of this is happening. Here we have the marriage entry. Sorry, Kathleen, can we go back one? Here we have the civil marriage entry as it appeared in the, a clerk's copybook showing the marriage entry for this in the state of Missouri in St. Louis. It says, I certify that I have this day, entered into the holy hands of matrimony, et cetera, but it's, and it says that it's Charlie Winter and Carolina F. Futcher. They were married 3rd day of August AD 1865, and then in parentheses it said St. Mary's, and then it has the name of the priest who actually did the marriage, and then below that it actually has the recorder who would have been the clerk of the court. Now, usually when I see a marriage, when I'm trying to help somebody break down a brick wall, my first question to them is, well, who married them? And that is usually the question that they can't answer because, yes, they found the marriage record, but all they cared about was the date of marriage and the bride and the groom's names. If it is not a JP, if it is any minister whatsoever, you have a church record that you can turn to for potentially additional information. I had the name of the priest. I had that it was St. Mary's in St. Louis. Now, it's possible there were multiples of that. Fortunately, St. Louis has a great list of all the Catholic priests. And when they, up to I think 1900, and where they served throughout the city. So I was able to match the priest with St. Mary of the Victories Parish in St. Louis, and their records were available through Family Search, and I found the actual entry. It was a Catholic Catholic parish. Now, because this was in the time frame between 1854 the mid 1800s, the entry is in Latin, and so we have that going for us there to add to our fun. So instead of being Charles, he is listed as Carolus, and then we have the additional information about that he is the son of Caspar Winter and Petronilla Weber, that he was 25 years old, and that he's marrying Carolina Francisca, who is the daughter of Johannes Fuchs and Aurelia Rebholz. Additionally, so that's the part that's underlined in red. Additionally, the top two signatures are for Carl Winter, who ultimately gets changed to Winterer, and Carolina Fuchs. So the bride and the groom signatures are there, and then below that are the people who were present when they were married. The one directly below Carolina is Georg Fuchs, which her father was Johann Georg Fuchs. He tended to go by Georg, his middle name. So again, we've got a lot of information supplied in this church record that if we just left it at the civil record, we would not have this information. We also use a lot of published vital records, and especially for Massachusetts, there's an entire collection of roughly 226 individual towns that had their records through 1850 that were published. This is one of those towns. This is Mendon, and I have highlighted a rectangle of certain individuals, and then in the enlarged rectangle, I have underlined Isaiah, son of Joseph and Deborah, born June 26, 1757. And then there is what looks like a Josiah, or a Josiah, son of Joseph Jr., born June 26, 1739. They look to be about 18 years apart, and one might think that we're looking at 3 generations of births or of people here. Joseph Jr. being what would ultimately be the grandfather, Josiah, who would be the father, who magically gets turned into Joseph, and then Isaiah being the son. We cannot assume any of this. So when I saw this, I decided that this would be a situation where it might be important to turn to the original records. And in this, and I'm not going to lie, I had to go through page by page looking for this entry, but I did manage to find that a very lengthy paragraph that basically says Isaiah Corbett, son of Joseph Corbett and Deborah, his wife, was born June the 26th, 1757. The said Isaiah Corbett, through a mistake, is recorded in the old book on page 172, born June the 26th, 1739, and have rectified and altered as is above recorded. So basically, when they were abstracting the records, they took the entry that was in the quote old book with the June 26, 1739 birth date, and they put it into the manuscript. For whatever reason, when they got to Isaiah Corbett's entry here for 1757, they didn't pull out the mistaken one. So both ended up being published, and many individuals have thought that Josiah was a misspelling of Joseph and that he was the father of Isaiah. And as we can see here, that did not turn out to be the case. Another thing about abstracted vital records, for especially that collection of 229 books that we often refer to as the Tan series because of the cover of the bindings. However, many of the town's records that were abstracted were not just limited to the vital records as they appeared in the town records. And so what you'll see is in some volumes, such as Newberry here, you will see an entry and then you'll see a little cryptic code at the end. In this case, I've highlighted two of them, CR2 and CR5. The CR stands for church record, and then the 2 and the 5 identify which of the churches that were also abstracted and included in these published records. So CR2 turns out to be the second church, now First Church of West Newberry, and CR5 is Byfield Church. So I could then go to those church records. And we do always need to look and see when certain things are published. For instance, going back to my grandfather, the Woburn records of births, deaths, and marriages up through 1900 were published in 1900. And so in that volume, my grandfather will forever be known as George T., son of Henry H. and Elizabeth Dollar, born August 20th, 1899. And why is that? Because the amendment didn't hit. The earliest amendment that we've found doesn't happen until January in 1918. So let's turn to church records now. Very often church records are sought only if vital records are unavailable. Hopefully from my example with the marriage record in the vital records, you should see that they should always be examined if they exist. They often will include information that was not asked or was not a part of the civil record. And then depending on the denomination, as we saw with that marriage, they may be in another language. Here we have the certificate and record of marriage from the state of New York. This was in New York City for Kurt Vondel and Eloise Rowe. And this happened in Manhattan. And then I have highlighted that at the bottom, it does say that they were married by the laws of New York at the Church of the Transfiguration. Below that is the chicken scratch that is the minister. I still have no idea who he is. However, fortunately, I was able to make out the church's name and I could work with that. Once again, we have a church marriage blank that was filled out and supplied, giving a lot of the same information, which is, I think, why people don't bother to go to the church records. However, once again, we are getting additional information here. So we are finding out that in this case, Kurt, his religious denomination, he identified as Lutheran. The Church of the Transfiguration is an Episcopal church. Yes, it's both Protestant, but when asked his religious denomination, he said he was Lutheran, and just below that, you will see that he had been baptized as such. Once again, we've got the marriage that I talked about just a minute ago. We'll go through this very, very quickly again, but remember, if you're seeing this type of a register entry where the clerk is recording it, look to see who married them. If it's anything other than a justice of the peace, you want to pursue that entry. Now, after I went and found this entry, I went back to the index to the volume using the page number to find this entry because it was not always the easiest thing. And it was under the W surnames, and it was not as apparent because I had looked originally for this in the index, and then I just went through and looked until I found 1865 and started going through these. However, what I did find was that he was listed as Carl Winter in the index, and the information on her parents is what solidified this for me because I knew more about her than I did about him when I found this record. Another thing that's very, very important, especially when it comes to baptisms, is that you want, and the marriages, but definitely baptisms, you want to see who either they're called sponsors or godparents are for the child. They tend to be close, either relatives or very dear friends of the couple who had the baby. So in this case, we have a baptism of a Catherine Murray at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1849. Her parents are James Murray and Catherine Crowley. The sponsors are Thomas Murray and Mary Crowley. My first question should now be, are these sponsors related to Catherine's parents? And if so, do they maybe have better paper than James and Catherine do, who we are struggling to take back to Ireland? A similar example here with a marriage of Peter Gartland and Ellen Donaghy in 1831, also at St. Mary's Catholic Church in Charlestown. Looking again at the witnesses who are there, what we're seeing is that the two witnesses both share the surname of Ellen Donaghy, the bride. So again, who are William and Catherine? Are they married to each other? And are they related to Ellen? Every time I get a particular document and there is a similarity in names or something, that's a question that needs to be answered. And just when you thought it was safe to go back into the abstracts, I have been working in some records of late that are often referred to as the Vosburgh collection. Over on the left-hand side, you will see Royden Woodward Vosburgh. He has transcribed a ton of church records in New York, and they are basically a go-to if you are doing New York research. What happened was, as I was working on Family Search and I was using their new AI system, I actually discovered that some of the AI was taking me to the original church abstract of the left, and others were taking me to this second, basically copied volume that is at the DAR library that was done by Francis S. Fast, who copied it out of basically the book on the left. And what happens is you see a difference in how they are arranged. Now, the top one is part of the Vosburgh original transcription in 1923. And what he's basically done, because this was a tombstone inscription, is he has literally put the marks to separate like each line that would have been on the tombstone. Then he says there's a footstone. He also says this stone is much worn and the above is possibly not quite correct. There is also a verse which is illegible. Now, according to his, she died in 1831. She was 18 years old. That would have made her born about 1813. If we look at the fast copy of Vosburgh, we see most of the same information that Vosburgh has included. It's arranged differently. However, they have cross-referenced this with a baptism for this very same Elsie Britton Messereau that was on page 31 of this same volume. And it says she was baptized June 9th, 1818. Her birth was given as August 30th, 1817. This would make the death date 1836, not 1831. So you can see two different versions here, and one of them, they have gone the extra mile and given us the cross-reference. Census records are another resource we use all the time. Federal census, the decennial enumerations began in 1791. They continue every 10 years. Some states have taken to doing a state census in between the federal censuses. So the federal census, 1790, 1800, etc., like 1900, 1910, you may find a state census in 1905. The questions and information, regardless of whether it's federal or state, has changed over time. And there are often columns that just have a little like tick, what I call a tick mark. It looks like a little slash. These columns can hold clues. Here we see an 1870 census. We're going back to Carl Winter, aka Charles Winterer, in 1870 Missouri. And within this item, we are seeing that he has, he's the head of the household. He and his wife, Caroline, say they were born in Baden. That's column 10. And then at the far right in column 19, so second from the right, you see a little slash mark where on Charles's line. This column is asking whether or not he can vote. If he's over 21, can he vote? If he can, they were told that they were supposed to put a mark. What this tells me, though, is that Charles, who was not born in the United States, but is allowed to vote in the United States, has become a naturalized citizen by 1870. Now, sometimes using the scans of the microfilm, reading the headings can be very, very difficult and can be, a little hard to decipher what they're saying. On the National Archives website, archives.gov, you will find that they have census forms for all of their federal censuses from 1790 going forward, 1950 being our most recently made available. With this, you can get a better sense of the headings. Also, when you abstract something, you tend to pay a little more attention to the information that is on the form. And I like, as you can tell, I'm sort of into color. And one of the things was, yes, the yellow column 19 says he can vote. They were born in Baden. But what if one of the children, if I was researching a child who was, much older, and he was born in Missouri, the next two columns to the right of place of birth asked if the father was foreign born and the mother was foreign born. So even if I had a native born person, I would have been able to identify that this was sort of the end of my US born ancestry, that the next generation that I'm looking for are immigrants because of the tick marks there. And then also in some of the censuses, we do have questions about whether or not a child was married within a year or was born within the year. And in 1870, they even made you put down the month that it happened. Here we see an 1850 census in Maine, and I was helping a gentleman in a consultation. He was looking at the Philbrook family, and James Philbrook and his wife Belinda and all of their children there were listed. And then he noticed that Henry Haskell was directly below this, and he said, "Oh, James's daughter Mary married Henry Haskell. That's got to be them." Which, yes, we were looking at it, but what I was able to show him was that if he looked at the numbers and the columns to the left of the names, the first column is asking for the number of the dwelling as it's being visited by the enumerator. The second column is asking about the family, again, in order of visitation. And the fact that the dwelling is 559, and then we have families 578 and 579, tells me they are sharing the same actual dwelling, likely all living together in the same house. And we did notice as we were digging into this further that Henry, who is 50, he's quite a bit older than his wife, Mary. He has absolutely no occupation. And I believe that the gentleman I was working with said, oh, he sounds like he was a real keeper. Deeds and land records, nobody likes to read these because they are full of legalese. However, they can solve a lot of questions. Yes, they have a ton of legal boilerplate language. However, there are certain phrases that can help you. For instance, if a phrase in the description of the property says undivided part, or if you find deed after deed after deed where like 5 or 6 children or individuals are all selling a piece of the same property, those are possible clues that they're all related. Likewise, if a bunch of family are mentioned selling a piece of property en masse, there is likely a relationship between all of them. Additionally, you want to look for the right of dower, which was a release that a wife had to say, yes, I have not been coerced in saying we can sell this piece of property. And never ever forget, witnesses should also be examined. I am embarrassed to say that this particular document was in my files, I want to say from the second trip I took to Salt Lake City for a good 10 years before it dawned on me that it was actually giving me a clue with the verbiage of the undivided sixth part of, and then it went into the, north half of the Northwest, went into the legal description of the land. This should have been a clue to me. Second, should have been the fact that this particular document here was dated in 1856, yet what I'm seeing is a typed volume. So both of these things should have spoken to me that this was out of the norm and I needed to do some bigger digging. Here is a sample where a bunch of family are all mentioned in this particular uh, deed here. This happens to be for the Myers family in Lincoln County, Kentucky. And the gentleman in question died without a will. And a lot of people just give up at that point and say, well, I'm never going to be able to figure out who the kids are. However, I was able to identify the person I was interested in, which was Nancy Myers, who is intermarried with John Zimmerman, who were the people that I was researching. And then as I went through further down, it said that these were all heirs and legal representatives of David Myers, deceased. So again, you've got to read these deeds to see what they're telling you. And here we have a sample of the, let's see if yes, I did blow this up. So this is a deed that was written in Richmond County, New York. It was in volume F, and I've highlighted what appears to be a part that is separate from the whole of the deed. As we zoom in on that, what we see is that the clerk has, quote, examined the said Sophie separate and apart from her husband, and she did also acknowledge that that she executed the same of her own free will and accord without any fear, threats, or compulsion uh, by her husband, her said husband. This is that release of dower, the dower right, the 1/3 interest she has in this piece of property. And it is why you will see in many states that when a man buys land, he may be listed by himself, but when he turns around to sell it, there is very often a wife identified as well. And that's because she has to go through this examination. All right, let's talk a little about draft cards. So there are draft cards available for World War I and for World War II. different draft cards for different groups. There are some that were born, a special set of draft cards for those who were born between 1877 and 1897, who may have had a World War II card, even if they didn't have a World War I card. Usually when you're using the World War I draft card registration cards on Ancestry, you type in your information, and I'm not sure that everybody realizes this, but if you put a place of birth in, you may actually eliminate the card that you're seeking, because there were 3 different cards done and only 2 of them asked for place of birth. This was the very first card ever done in that particular draft, and that one was dated June 5th of 1917. And I have highlighted question 4 was it had to do with his uh, naturalization status or his citizenship. Question 5 had to do with where he was born. And then question 9 and 10 indicate his marital status, etc. As we move on to this card, this one was done in June of 1918. This was the second of the 3 drafts that were done. This one has question 4 still asking, this time asking where you were born. And question 5 has to do with your citizenship. And there were 5 options. So you could either be a native of the US, a naturalized citizen, an alien, you could have declared your intention to become a citizen, or you could be a non-resident or citizen Indian. And so in this case, they would cross out everything except for the one that applied to you. Likewise, in this one, I didn't highlight it, but question 7 asked for the place of the father's birthplace, something that in this instance, Ralph here was born in Philadelphia, but his dad was born in Italy. And then the third and final version of the draft card, this one was done in September of 1918. This one did not have a place asking for where you were born. Still had your birth date and everything because everything was based on age, but there is no place of birth. We have now moved our race up to question 5. We have made a box for citizenship if you're native born, if you're naturalized. They've also added what you'll see in that purple box, which is saying that the individual in question was a citizen by father's naturalization before registrant's majority. In other words, when dad got naturalized, the person was still a child under the age of 18 or 21, depending on the year in question, and that they automatically became a US citizen. And in each case, the second page of these cards, or the back of these registration cards, have the date of registration, and that is how you know whether or not your card is going to have the information you seek. And then I mentioned that for those who may or may not have had a World War I draft card, in this case, William Albion did, and he had the 1917 one. He had a June 7, 1917, the first card. So it did tell us where he was born. But if you get one who didn't, and he was born between those years that I mentioned, so 1877 to 1897, the men aged 45 to 65, they also had to register for World War II. It was known as the old man's draft. And that always asked for place of birth in that particular card. Immigration records, they can tell you a lot. Passenger lists are lists of passengers compiled from other resources. We often, again, use passenger lists and passenger manifests interchangeably. So a passenger list is a list of passengers that was compiled from some other resource. Passenger manifests are the pages that were kept by the ships and the shipping companies that were required by civil laws, and they start at different times. For the US, the passenger manifest began in 1820. And then, of course, naturalization records can also prove useful. As we progressed in from 1820 up into the 1900s, the number of questions we begin to ask on a passenger list is very, very different. And so here we have a 1903 passenger list, and I've blown up the section, and the highlighted yellow is the part that was in the red rectangle in the above smaller version. And then I have also underlined the act of Congress that was approved when it was approved, because you can literally go and look and see what has changed about the requirements of the passenger list. But in 1903, they began to ask for last residence. So not only did you get the vague country nativity, uh, and race of people, which was again a later item, but you got place of last residence, which for many of our immigrants was the place where they were born. Beginning in 1907, we actually finally decided that we would just flat out ask, where were you born? So it's not until 1907 that we get that information. However, as again, you can see here, we have uh, a lot of information. In 1907, we begin to see two-page spreads for the passenger list because there are so many questions. When you're searching online, you're going to be taken to the page that has the name of your ancestor that you're seeking. Always, 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 if it's after 1907, you want to go one image to the right to see the second page. Now, the second page, which is the lower part of this example, does not have the name of your ancestor. So you've got to match the line number because that does carry over. However, in this 1907 passenger list, column 11 was asking, who in the old country have you left behind? And then on the second page, in the subsequent column 18, it is asking, who are you going to in the United States? And so for Kurt here, we have him identified as leaving his mother, Amelia, and then traveling with his brother, Otto, on the same ship, although he was not listed next to him on the passenger list. So we're going to blow those up for you so you can see them. And what you'll see is 11 saying that his mother in Ruthlingen in Germany is who he left behind, and that he's supposedly traveling with his brother Otto. I did find him subsequently on a passenger list, but I had to look for him. So you know, you always want to look at that. All right, and then we have a naturalization record here that is like the final step, basically. So naturalization had 3 steps. You have your declaration of intention. That was a minimum of 3. You had to wait a minimum of 3 years after arrival to do that. Step 2 then had to be done a minimum no sooner than 2 years after step 1. And then the third step was the certificate of naturalization, usually happened soon after step 2. And so this particular document here was the step 2, the petition of naturalization. And in this example, the person had reached out to me and he said, okay, this appears to be like just one of them. Where else can I go? And what I realized as I was reading through, again, the whole document, that it said his primary declaration of intention, so his step 1, was done at the police court in the city of Manchester, and it gave the date. Now, the person didn't have to go to the same court to get each step. Neither did he have to go to a specific court. If it was a court, a legal, lawful court, he could go to any court in the land and he could start the process. So, big tip, not all records are online, and you're going to have to sometimes go offline and turn to either a courthouse or a repository to dig further. So we are actually going to skip this case study because we are well out of time. A lot of the records that were in the Kurt Vondel case study, you have already seen as examples throughout the lecture. So in review, lack of analysis actually builds those brick walls that we find so frustrating. You want to go beyond the information, the warm and fuzzy information that we expect to find. Ask questions. Who, why, how? Look for multiple records of the same event, especially if you've got a vital record and a church record.
All right. Thank you so much, Rhonda, for that excellent lecture this afternoon. So much information in there. As you could all see, we struggled to even contain this information in today's lecture. So I did just want to mention for you all, we are offering a online course in September that will kind of follow up on this topic. So that's here on the screen, piecing together the story, analyzing records, and drawing conclusions. Rhonda is one of our genealogists who's going to be presenting in this course. We're going to get to all of your questions in just a moment. I just wanted to quickly highlight kind of what's being offered in the course here. So you can see this will be 5 weeks. Here are the topics that will be covered on the screen. All of the sessions will be recorded, and the course materials will be available to view for the foreseeable future as well. So just wanted to let you all know about that, since it will kind of follow closely on the heels of what was covered in today's lecture. And again, we'll get to your questions in just a moment. You can see on your screen here some other events that we have coming up that might be of interest to you all. And you can learn more about these and all upcoming events at americanancestors.org/events. All right, so moving along to questions. So let's see here. So Rhonda, we did get a few questions in asking if you could reiterate the term undivided part and kind of what that signifies in a deed.
Sure. So anytime you see that something has been undivided, two things, it clues you into two things. There are multiple parts, and the parts are decided by how many heirs at law there are. So when a person dies intestate, but they have property, then that piece of property is not cut up into little tiny pieces. What instead happens is those who are to inherit based on the inheritance laws are given that undivided, 1/6 or whatever. So if in my example we had the 1/6, so that indicated that there were 6 individuals who had a 1/6 interest in that whole piece of property. And that turned out to be 6 children of the person who died. Sometimes you may find that somebody has like a 1/6 and then somebody else has like a 1/12. And what that might do, if it's all for the same piece of property, is it will clue you in that one of the individuals who would have been on that 1/6 level is deceased, and that person has 2 children. Because what you do is the descent continues down to the next generation if the person who was entitled to their share has deceased. And so anytime you see an undivided interest and like some kind of fraction, that is a clue that the person died intestate and that their property has now been divvied up, but only in a manner in which somebody either has to go around and buy from everybody, or what sometimes you'll see is like one of the kids will buy from all of their siblings to get the whole piece of property. But it's always a clue to dig further.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rhonda. Then some other questions here. Next up, were draft cards typically filled out by the person registering or by the draft official?
So you will probably see that the bulk of the information was filled out by the official. It usually matches the signature of the registrar. However, your ancestor did have to sign it. So that is their original signature on the card. And that means that they would have been there supplying the information. So yes, could spelling be a little different? Absolutely. But the information was being given by the man himself.
Okay, great. And then when did the three-step naturalization process begin in the United States?
Basically, as soon as we became a U.S., it was built into the Constitution, and the length of time between each step has kind of gone back and forth a little bit, especially in the early years, especially after the French Revolution. Everybody got a little nervous, and so like length of residency at one point was 12 years before you could begin the process. So ultimately, in the early 1800s, they sort of settle on the what I call the 3-2-5. In other words, 5 years for the whole process, three before you could apply for your declaration or you could declare your intent, two additional until you could petition for naturalization. Now, that doesn't mean they did it right away. Sometimes you'll see 5-6 years, sometime, before they do it, even start the process. Other times you'll see that they didn't do it until people were looking at them funny, maybe because of what was going on in Europe. And then they're like, okay, yeah, no, time for me to do this. Also, you will not necessarily find females until after 1920 when they got the right to vote.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then a question here. What does the release of a dower tell you? Does that tell you that her father owned the land before her marriage?
No. So anytime a married man purchased a piece of property, he could go out, he could buy the property to his heart's content. She will not be mentioned there. However, if he died intestate, she would have gotten 1/3 of all of his property, real and movable. So in other words, all the like cooking pots and stuff and any land he had. She would have got 1/3 off the top, even before the creditors can come in and say, give me my money. She is releasing that 1/3 dower right. It's not dowry, it is dower. Dowry is I'm the father of the bride and I'm going to pay you basically to marry my daughter. And the dower right was a way in which the woman could be protected because let's be honest, she doesn't get to go out and just get a job like today. And so that was a way of her having something to support herself and her children as, a widow. And so when he sells that piece of property, she has to go and say, yeah, no, I was not coerced. I'm doing this freely. Whether or not that was true depends on what we know about our ancestors. For not everybody was that going to be true, but that was the legal statement that was made. But that's why you don't see the wives when he's buying property, but you do see the wives when he's selling.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rhonda. Then a question. Today we have laws that prevent the father from being listed on the birth certificate if absent, unless they are the husband. Were there any similar restrictions in the past?
No. I mean, will you have birth certificates that don't have fathers? Absolutely. Absolutely. And if the child was baptized, I guarantee you that the clerk, the priest, the reverend, gonna say something about that. Will he out and out say who the father is? Probably not, unless he really knows. But they are not above putting those little notations in. So there was not like a law preventing the father from being listed. If the couple's married, they assume it's his. If she was unwed, but she knew who the father was, she could certainly say who it was. More often than not, though, you are not going to find him listed in the records for one reason or another. Either if she doesn't want the ramifications of being, you know, mistreated, if it was like she's the maid in the household and he's the son of the, richest man in town, those types of things. But there was no actual out and out law that said he could not be mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Um, Then a question here. Where does one begin when seeking church records? What are the next steps?
So as soon as I've got a marriage record, the first thing I will do, if it's in like Manhattan or St. Louis, a big city, Chicago, I'm going to turn to city directories to find the denomination I suspect based on, like, if it says priest, I'm going to go to the list of Catholic churches for a city directory, and I'm going to look to see if I can find the priest associated with a church. Once I've identified the church, I'm then going to turn to family search for the city or town in question, and I'm going to see if they were given permission to microfilm, thus digitize the records. If they if they're not there, then I'm going to look for, say, an archive, whether it be, so like the Methodist archive has a lot of records. So there's different places, and that's why I say everything's not online. A lot is, and boy, are we thankful for it. But in many cases, especially with church records, those are private records. And so you may still have to reach out to the church if it's still in operation. That's often my go-to first. And then if it's no longer in operation, I will turn my attention to an archive that may have taken in their records.
Okay, thank you. We'll do a couple more questions here. So we received a question. Someone asked if you could repeat the location of the National Archives resource page that allows one to examine and fill in details from specific census entries.
Sure. So the easiest way is go to archives.gov. And then once you're on that home page, there's a little gray one about researching your ancestors. Click that and then scroll down a little bit, like halfway down this page, and you will see like helps for family historic, like for genealogists. And there's a link to the charts there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Um, then let's see here. Question. Do naturalization records generally contain the parents' names?
Only if the parent is naturalizing and is listing their children. But what it will do, the more you get into the 1900s, is it's going to tell you exactly where they were born, which then allows you to turn to that. You've got an exact date of birth because this person is supplying this information and an exact place.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then a good question here on strategy that I think we'll end on for today. Someone asked, for those of us who may not have thoroughly reviewed documents and may have grabbed things based solely on the name, do you recommend a complete do-over or just str- uh, sorry, I want to get this right here. Do you recommend a complete do-over or just reviewing strategically, for example, going back and reviewing one ancestor at a time, all of the records found? Any thoughts on kind of how to approach that?
So if you have amassed a number of records, and I'm going to use an ancestry tree as an example. So you've linked all these records to your person. If you are working on that person, what you want to do is you want to go back and look at everything you've linked and make sure that it's really them. You know, even the names that we don't think are common turn out to be way more common than we think. So you want to reevaluate everything you've linked. Anytime you open up somebody in your ancestry tree or in your genealogy program, you say, oh, yeah, I'm going to work on trying to find his parents again. Go back and look and see what you've got. You may have actually built your own brick wall.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Rhonda. We've had a lot of great questions coming in. Unfortunately, that's all that we have time for today. But if you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team or definitely using our chat service. We have a free chat service which puts you in direct communication with a genealogist. And again, that's free and it's available to the public Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And to use that chat service, just go to americanancestors.org/chat. I highly recommend checking it out. It would be a great place to put any questions that we weren't able to get to today. You can also book a one-on-one consultation with our experts at the link shown on the screen or through the QR code displayed there as well. And I'll also mention that Rhonda is one of our genealogists who gives a lot of these consultations, so you can also book one with her if you'd like to do that. Thank you all again for joining us today. As you leave the program, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs as well. I hope to see you all at our online programs in the future, and goodbye for now.